Hello everybody and welcome to the 51st edition of the Frank and Stan chat. And as you can see this morning we have a guest. But before we go and introduce Mark Bawden, let's say hello to Stan. Stan, you're in a completely different venue. I mean, you're somewhere not in that little office.
Yeah. No, and desperately hoping that my phone signal will hold out because we're working on a tethered technology here.
Right.
Yes, I'm caravan in Anglesey.
All right. Well, it looks beautiful. It looks beautiful. Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I'll be going home later.
Mark, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Do you want to just introduce yourself, Mark, for those people who perhaps have not heard of you and the work you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm a performance psychologist. I started my work in the world of sport. And then I, somewhere way back when, I bumped into a guy called Dave Hewitt, who some people might know from Lancashire, who introduced me to the world of education and suggested that some of the stuff that I work on might be useful in education. And that's where I bumped into Stan. So I don't know how long ago that was, Stan, but
got to be close on 20 years.
20 years ago now. And then since then, we've moved away from sport, and now I've got my own company called Mindflick, working across lots of different high performance environments, essentially doing high performance coaching, but we develop all our own tools basically. So all of the tools that we use in teams and individuals and around leadership, we have a principle which is we develop all our own stuff because we like to think we want to be quite creative and innovative about things. So yeah, so that's what I do now.
Great. Yeah. So we've had Mike Rotherham on here twice before. It's always a pleasure to talk to Mike. I mean, is Mike in the same sort of setup as you?
Well, I thought you've prompted me really well here, Frank, because I was going to go at Stan about this. I was thinking, because obviously Mike, a very good friend and colleague and someone I worked with for many years. How has Mike got on twice before you've asked him? It must be that have I now got to, I'm definitely the bottom of the barrel. No, obviously I've worked with Mike for many years, and Mike does work with us here at Mindflick and does a lot of consultancy work for us. He's one of our high performance coaches, and of course we came from very similar backgrounds. I actually taught Mike on his master's degree at Sheffield University, so that's where we first met. But we've worked together pretty much ever since in many different guises. So yeah, very good friend and colleague. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, well, the normal run of it is what's caught your eye this week. So we'll go to Stan first. What's caught your eye this week, Stan?
Only recently, only really this morning, apart from everything else I'm involved with, was the loyalty thing this morning. I just looked at what price loyalty when Mr. Cummings seems to decided that his best option is to dish as much dirt as he can and leave himself looking sparkly white. It's I just think how much has the Prime Minister invested in somebody in the hope of getting that loyalty back, which seems to have failed somewhat.
Yeah. I mean, I tried to think about that in terms of school leadership and how important it is to feel that you can be honest and open and know that honesty and open won't be abused either immediately or at a later date, and it's actually a sort of sense of, for me, it's about trying to sort of understand, the sort of rationale behind it, the ethos, the culture that, that actually is deep rooted into somebody, and to try and draw that out and to surround yourself with people, perhaps who are willing to challenge you, but actually, deep down that they're decent people and that they've got a sort of an ethical approach that means that they won't dish the dirt on you,
Yeah, but Frank, you said honesty and openness.
I know. Yeah.
Those are two things which appear to be completely lacking.
Yeah. I think also the other thing was around. I cannot believe that. I mean, I'm doing work at the moment for the co-op, and I actually have a co-op phone. I know that when I leave the co-op, I leave that phone. You know what I mean? It's the record of my work with the co-op will disappear. There'll be an expectation that I won't download stuff. There's a confidentiality thing. It seems as though when Dominic Cummings was sacked, he basically walked out with his phone and all those papers and everything else became his property. It's amazing how slack all of that is compared to what would happen in a commercial setting. So what about you, Mark? What's caught your eye this week?
Well, I'm going to go. I mean, I'm going to go with something a bit optimistic, I think.
Yeah.
So things that caught my eye. So one of the things that caught my eye was Elon Musk. Again, Elon Musk is a really interesting figure, isn't he? Some might say controversial figure, but just you know, him talking about the fact that in 4 years' time we're going to have space flights to the moon, and you know, customers will go to the moon. General human beings will be able to fly to the moon rather than just, you know, astronauts. And you know, and I could see. I think he said that a Japanese billionaire had already booked 8 people onto a flight to the moon. You know, and I just think, I know there's a lot of problems on Earth or that we have to deal with, and obviously this year being, you know, really poignant for that. But I still believe you need visionaries. You need people still solving the big problems and stretching the boundaries of things. And I do think that Elon Musk is one of those people right now. And every time he sort of launches something new or innovates or comes up with one of his big plans, where the electric car or, you know, space flight, you know, I like it that people are out there still stretching the boundaries. You know, they're still still trying to find possibility, and I find that inspiring that people are able to do that.
Well, I agree. I mean, I've become more interested in astronomy as I got older, and I watched the flight of a drone on Mars last week with complete awe.
Yeah.
The thought that we have actually, mankind has managed to get a craft landing on Mars, and then has actually landed that safely in order to enable another sort of an aircraft of some sort to be lifted up and travel across the surface of Mars. I mean, that is unbelievable technology, isn't it? That is really stretching, you know. And my wife thought, oh, why are they doing that? But actually it was just the same as you, Mark. You know, because they can, and because, you know, it's amazing what that might lead to in terms of further development.
Yeah.
So it's awesome.
But it's linking people though, Frank, that have those visions and thoughts and ideas. And you know, when you look at the way things have been developed, some of them are absolute coincidences. You know, the heart pacemaker was because someone who was designing a timer for a bomb met with someone who was trying to solve a problem with a heart patient.
Wow.
And the two spoke and said, actually, I could do that. And the pacemaker was born as a result. So there's those connections between the people who have the big vision and the people who see the need for the next gen, you know, the next problem that needs solving.
And actually, what's interesting, Mark, I'm going to bring you in a minute here to something. I think I'm going to link you here, if you let me just have this, is that, you know, it's the fact that these are all done in very, you know, not done in isolation. This requires expertise drawn from a wide range of areas, you know, and actually how those experts connect and contribute to each other on a common, you know, cause, you know, is really sort of like, and when I look at education and the way that young people are taught, you know, often it's in isolation. They may be in a room on their own, but they're not encouraged to collaborate. It's very much about, well, I have some knowledge and I'm going to give it to you, as if to say, well, just by having the knowledge, you're therefore got the skill to actually share that knowledge and know how to contribute within a team setting. I mean, before that's a good link, I think, Mark, for you. But if I can just think about what I also want to be positive here about what inspired me this week. Yesterday, Steve Munby, who I meet virtually every couple of months, connected me with a woman called Liz Robinson, who runs something called Big Education. And basically, Stein, I think they are an organization, they have a small mat in London, but basically they're looking at leadership, ensuring that actually leaders of today, when asked, you know, what's your ambition, don't say, well, it's to be outstanding in Ofsted, you know. And it was a really interesting discussion about the sorts of stuff that Stan and I would have had as leadership training years ago, to think outside of the box, because there were no boxes, you know. And in a way, it was a bit of a Wild West territory in those days. But actually I feel as though we've become quite constrained in thinking around what, you know, visionary leadership might look like in education, you know, because there's so much accountability. But it was really uplifting. I was, you know, when you connect with somebody for the first time, you just know, I think we're going to hit this off, you know, and it was just a brilliant half-hour chat. So I just want to reach out to Liz and say, you know, thank you for, well, my week ended on a real high, I have to say.
Actually, Frank, when Mark and I first hooked up, the stuff Mark was bringing to education was absolutely world-beating. Nobody'd been anywhere near that kind of, not people had done tricks and warm-ups where you said, what kind of person are you? But nobody got underneath all that with the science and then started to develop. At the time was the colours when Mark was, his company was called Metaphorics. And Mark was always concerned that it was too sporty. And I could see it didn't matter. And we put a group of head teachers together and they were just blown away in one weekend, I think it was, Mark, on top in the Lake District.
Right, yeah.
Absolutely blew them away. And it was, don't worry, Mark, this is what we need. And I don't think we've ever looked back, really.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because when we talk about do things transfer, I mean, at the end of the day, we're always talking about people, aren't you?
Yes.
You're talking about people, relationships, teams working together, communication, you know, what happens to us when we experience stress and pressure. It's all the same stuff. And because we're human beings and we've got the same blob of custard in our heads, you know, like we're all trying to deal with the same stuff to some level. And so, yeah, it was very fascinating going back to those days and in those early days of education. I think things have moved on somewhat now in the sense that one of the things that we see constantly now is that people are, you know, we talk about this phrase now, the need to adapt constantly is happening around us. And we've never seen it more than last year where the whole world's had to adapt. I mean, education's had to adapt probably so much, hasn't it? There's been almost unbelievable what they've been able to achieve. But at the heart of everything we believe is being able to recognize like what your natural way of doing things is, but then recognize when the context shifts around you and adapt to changing circumstances. So providing people with stuff that allows them to do that around leadership, I think is key. And just going back to Frank, what you said earlier on about what leadership looks like now, one of the things I was thinking about that we went back to, Stan, when we first started working with leaders is I think leaders had more wriggle room then. That they had more freedom for, you know, you were saying about the high levels of accountability, Frank, there. I sense, because we were talking about quite creative things we were bringing in, allowing leaders to experiment a little bit around how they develop their teams and brought different ideas around resilience, well-being, around emotional intelligence, around all those things that we know are good, but it felt like they had a bit of wriggle room to play, whereas I feel like that wriggle room is running out. And therefore, people are more likely to walk a very straight line. Yeah, that must be really challenging for the modern.
It's interesting. I was talking to Liz yesterday about, you know, an attempt to actually improve leadership through national programs. You know, that feels or felt at the time probably a really good thing to do. You know, but actually, I think that what's happened is some of the people coming through those programs found them useful initially, but then actually felt, well, what else? You know, is this actually what I'm meant to be doing? And of course, all those programs are riddled with political, you know, elements, and actually a preferred way of doing it. You know, and actually, I think that for me, the leadership element, leadership has changed for me. You know, and I think as I've got older, I've better understood where my strengths and weaknesses are. And actually, I've not been keen to sort of just stick with my strengths. I've wanted to challenge my weaknesses, you know, as well. So, but actually, it's taken me a while to work those out. And I think that there is probably more time needed for leaders to find themselves, you know, within themselves as well.
I think I've just finished a course with Mike and Paul Duckworth with about 50 heads on it, and still the same philosophy of wriggle room, you know, knowing yourself, knowing the people you work with. And some heads have said, wow, this is absolutely fantastic stuff. And I wish I'd known about it earlier, and it's going to influence my thoughts. We're going to rethink the culture in school. Others have said, yeah, but the reality is Ofsted are going to be coming shortly. So back to what you were saying, Frank, that accountability is hard to bypass. And it looked from somebody looking in when you're doing the training that it's easy for you to say, but the reality is I'm at school in difficulty and I'm going to get clobbered at the next inspection.
Yeah. I think though that there's a lack of, I mean, Mark, I used to work for Ofsted. I do think if you do it, whatever you do, if you do it really, safely and do it really well, that there will be a place. I think that I have a sufficient confidence that Ofsted will see through that, and actually want to reward those that have got that sort of vision. But I think that the thing for me though is that we were talking before about how this pandemic and the way that teams are working, how that has changed. I mean, I think you had some observations, Mark, about we've moved to a new place. It's not the old place, it's a new place, but I think there is some uncertainty about what that might mean going forward.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting, isn't it? We've seen so many positives from going into the online world, as well as massive challenges. All of a sudden things have felt a bit more efficient at times. You've realized actually you can trust people to work from home and don't need to be looking over their shoulder. Actually, people can work very well. You can actually get more, sometimes you feel like you can get more done in a day. So there's lots of positives of working online that we've discovered. But of course, we're going to move to a hybrid world now, which is going to be a combination of some online, some face-to-face work, etc. And I think it's really fascinating seeing what happened to the actual dynamics of teams during this transition, that we've gone from being quite, face-to-face, then almost very online, and now we're going to move into a slightly middle ground, certainly in the world of business anyway. And I think what we found was when the world went online, at first, I think people thought, well, this is, we had a lot of very positive things about it, but in terms of dynamics of teams, the one thing that people started to recognize is teams started operating a lot more like working groups. And working groups don't need to interact with one another in order to be able to achieve the task. They can just come together, they can go through an agenda, they can update each other, share information. And if everyone knows what each other are doing, we can move on quite well. But teams that operate like that, they require people to interact with one another, to actually support, challenge each other, share information, collectively problem solve. They've got a purpose beyond just their own function. And what happens is in the online world, what we've noticed is the subtleties of communication that happen in teams decreased massively. So the subtleties, I mean, is you might be in a team meeting in the physical world, and someone might say something, you might disagree. You might not mention that in the meeting, but just as you're leaving the meeting, you're walking down the corridor, you say, Deborah, could I just catch you for a second? I noticed in that meeting, when I mentioned that, you didn't seem to agree with me, but we didn't really get a chance to talk about that. And you have that little corridor conversation, or you present something and someone that's usually vocal about it doesn't mention anything. You say, after the meeting, you say, can we just grab a coffee, or should we grab a lunch? And subtleties, you're constantly building trust and reconnecting the layers of trust within the team. We call them like human check-ins are constantly happening. We probably don't even know we're doing them a lot of the time, but all of that stuff has reduced massively. So the opportunities to have the little 2-minute chat, the little, can I just check, can we grab lunch? All of that went in the online world because we were just on task. And subsequently, trust, which is obviously at the heart ingredient that makes teams work, slowly, I think, for many teams started to dwindle away. And you started seeing little bits of paranoia creeping into teams, like just doubting people's intention behind what they're saying. And because you haven't got a chance to sense check it with them in an informal way. And there's a really good video that I saw by Simon Sinek where he said, trust is built outside of the meetings and it's tested inside the meetings. And in the online world, all we had was the meeting itself. So the result of that has been that teams that have formed during the pandemic haven't built the foundations of trust from which to have robust discussion. And teams that already existed sometimes they've seen really positive things as a result of it, but they've also sometimes, some of the relationships within that, they've been challenged in a different kind of way. So we've been busy working on how do you set the conditions to maintain trust in this sort of hybrid world we're going into, which is going to be a bit of a combination of both. So yes, that's been quite interesting actually, and I think that's been across the board. We've seen it in sport, we've seen it in business, we've seen it in the creative industries as well. So that's been interesting.
Yeah. It sort of makes me, I mean, I was notorious when I worked, I still work for the guy, but when I was in the office regularly, I was spending most of my time in the coffee shop. I must have drunk so much coffee, but that actually was just doing what I think you're saying. It was also building up an environment where you could just chat. You know, there was no agenda. I don't have those conversations on Zoom in quite the same way. You know, meetings seemed to be for a reason, whereas I would just wander down because I needed a break, and so did somebody else. And you know, I don't chat about family stuff as well. You know, in the way that you would with a colleague that you're meeting face to face. You know, I never say on a Zoom, "Well, how's your family doing?" before we kick off. You know, it's straight into the business side of it.
Yeah, those things are really important. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, thinking back to when I took over a failing team in Lancashire, months later, when things were so much better, and we were talking, saying, "Well, how did it work for you?" One of the people who I have great respect for, who was new at the time, and I said, "What's the difference? You know, what made that difference? It's important we know." And she said, "The first time you walked past me, I was sitting outside in the sun, and you asked me what I was doing, how I was doing, you know, what my job was." And it said, nobody else in management since I came here has ever taken that interest. And it was only virtually move out of my way, you're on the steps. But it was just that little touch of showing some kind of interest in somebody that made a big difference to her. And she just, I mean, she flew after that. So, you know, those things will be missing now, won't they? Unless you take the time to mail or ring people afterwards.
What do you think, Mark? I mean, I'm interested in, you know, where do you think leadership needs to go when it's moved away from this sort of operational crisis around the pandemic? You know, because it's not as if you can just switch over. You know, this will become very gradual, won't it? And schools will be experiencing this now as infection rates reduce and more adults you know, are vaccinated, and hopefully we don't have another variant that doesn't work. But you know, moving towards that position of you know, looking beyond the pandemic and looking towards recovery, and what the country and what individuals need in order to sort of help us all have a brighter future. How do you think leadership will need to adapt to that?
Well, I think the first thing is that I think the challenge that we've seen in this phase of leadership has been when we went into crisis mode. It was, you know, it was very much everyone was in reactive mode, and it was people were almost responding to new information every day, and it was and things like, you know, the well-being of staff and all of those things were obviously a massive priority, as well as we're obviously in the start of the pandemic. What's really interesting, and I think that the tricky challenge in this next phase for leadership is going to be the expectation around performance and hitting results is now back. Whereas there was a phase where, whilst no one ever said it doesn't matter about performance, but people recognized that we're in a state that we haven't been in before. And there was, again, go back to our phrase, a certain level of wriggle room around that. But the challenge for leaders now is going to be, how do we get our school, organization, business, whatever, sports team to perform whilst making sure the well-being and the support of our people is really strong coming out of this thing. And sometimes what happens is we don't do both at the same time. We swing the pendulum from one to the other. And so I think the challenge for leaders is about how they get both of those things. So how do we make sure we are going back to making sure we're actually hitting the targets, we are actually performing well, because we're going to have to move forward. But we've got to consider that we're going to have a workforce of people who have had such a range of different experiences over the last year. Some people that, I've spoken to some people who said, this has been like a nice rest for me. Whilst I understand that other people have had a horrendous time, for me, and other people have been in 12 months of absolute fear. And so for leaders, taking people on a bit of a journey, they're going to have to be able to manage both of those things. And I think that's going to be the fine art. And you know, to do that, we're going to have to adapt on the fly. We're going to have to be able to adjust to the new situations that come to us, but we're going to have to be able to understand that both of those things are going at the same time. So I think that's going to be a real challenge for leadership, because the temptation is to do one or the other. Right, let's be very supportive, understanding, or right, now's the time to really get the results. And I think that's going to be the big challenge.
So I was waiting for Stan. I thought Stan was going to say something. His mouth moved.
What's the answer, Mark? How do we do it? Is it just being aware of both and making sure that as you drive staff towards performance, you still underpin it with well-being? Or is there a technique you can use to make sure these things are coming together rather than swinging the pendulum?
Yeah, I don't think there's any sort of miracle pill for it. I think the start of that is reminding yourself
right,
that when we're coming up with new initiatives, new ideas, when we're talking about moving things forward, that you keep those two things, that they can feel sometimes at opposite ends of the continuum. You keep those two things at the front of your mind and recognizing all the time that they will have an interaction with one another. And as long as you're reminding yourselves of those things, I think you've got that, something that you mentioned, Frank, at the start, you've got that sort of like that divergent thinking then going on. And I think that is the key.
I do think, Mark, it's time for, there needs to be some sort of formal taking stock, I think, as well. I think this is a really fantastic, I think it would be wrong. I mean, I'm a trustee of a trust with 4 schools in it. We have left senior leaders, we've supported them, but actually we want to have a conversation about what we want to change. You know, this does feel like a step onto something slightly different. And I think that there's probably a need for, you know, those that have the power in these organizations to come together to really think about what does that future look like. And I'm not suggesting that we stop everything that we've done, but I think for me, you know, we've had a number of guests on here who have spoken about the digital world, and actually, you know, things, AI, technology, you know, robotics, all of that is going to play a big part in the future. And I'm not sure that some schools have really thought about how they change what they do to enable young people to catch onto that and to actually contribute to that. So, you know, for me, it's some of the big thinking about why we're here, what we're trying to do, you know, all that sort of stuff. This is a time to, I think, to do it. If you're going to shift, not have a revolution, but shift to something else or emphasize something else. This is the time to do it.
My issue with that, Frank, is we were saying that in October. Now's the chance to take all the things and make it go. And I just suspect next September we'll still be saying now's the time we should be doing something, until we get to we should have done something about it when we had the chance.
No, I agree. I mean, I think we thought in October, Mark, that, you know, this was a time when people could take a little bit of, not time out, because obviously it's been frantic, but there, you know, to just give yourself a little bit of time to think about some of these bigger issues. But I think the scale of the challenge has been so great that there's been no time for that. But again, just thinking about, there's been no opportunity to bring those teams together, you know, whether that's a board of directors or whatever, you know, with the CEO, you know, these have been very testing times. So, but yeah, I'd encourage anybody to, you know, to speak to Stan or speak to Mark or somebody about, you know, because some of this needs guidance. I've always felt that if you're going to shift, you know, I want to be, as a CEO or head teacher, you know, I want to play my part in the shaping of it. I don't want to be the person that's actually going to have to stand at the front of the room and direct everything, because that, there's a limit to what my bandwidth on all of that is. So I really think it's time to.
Yeah, I think, you know, we've used this word several times, of wriggle room, but actually that's what leaders need to give other people, and it's what senior leaders need to give to leaders to allow them.
His signal dying on it.
Stan's run out of wriggle room there. Yeah. He's run out of bandwidth. He's run out of bandwidth wriggle room.
Anyway, I think we probably should just see if we can get to the end of it.
To use
That's the most coherent bit I've heard Stan this morning.
to come up with new ideas without the threat of
And we lost you there. You were in full flow, but we lost you.
I know, I'm unstable. Sorry.
Don't worry. Okay, well, I think actually we've had our 30 minutes, so it's been great to talk to you, Mike. Mike, if somebody was interested in your work, how would they get in touch with you?
They'd probably go to the Mindflick website if they were interested. So www.mindflick.co.uk, and yeah, you'll see what we do, more our coaching and the various different things that we do. But yeah, feel free to get in touch.
Is that coaching done at a school level, or is it primarily done at an individual leader or a team of leaders?
Yeah, well, we coach individuals, we coach teams, and we can coach organizations as well as a whole now. We use you were talking about technology before. We've got technology now that allows us to be able to coach en masse. But yeah, we do everything from individual to teams as well. So yeah, combination of all, really.
Fantastic. Well, Stan, I hope you get a bit more stable.
Yeah.
And and hopefully we'll catch up with everybody for our 52nd episode next week. Technology withstanding all of this. We've got I think it's Sam Twistleton on next week. Is that correct, Stan?
Yeah.
We've lost Stan. So I'm going to say goodbye from the Frankenstein chat and thank Mark Bawden for contributing today. So I'll stop the recording and see you all next week.
Thanks very much, Frank. Cheers, Stan.